Hello again, Smash Up fans. I'm back at the very tail end of 2021 with another video, because I spent pretty much this entire year of Smash Up play on a single tournament of decks designed to answer one of the questions that I like to know the answer to in this game. What are currently the very strongest possible decks you can play in a 1v1 game of Smash Up? I would love to know this for every game size, but realistically, 1v1 has the advantage that it's actually possible to define such a thing as optimal play in 1v1, so there can be a correct answer to this question. Whereas in 3-player, you have to make a certain number of assumptions about how the other players play in order to answer that question. Now, beyond the fact that there's only 2 game sizes, technically, if you include 2v2, where there is a correct answer to a question like this, it also can be a massive undertaking to try to figure this out, and so I don't try to do it very often. I last really tried to answer the question, what is the very top deck, all the way back in 2016, when it was a much easier problem because 1v1 had a clear top 4 factions if you played enough games. Geeks were number 1, aliens were number 2, robots were number 3, kitty cats were number 4, and beyond that it wasn't so clear, but I figured out enough to say that, if there's 2 players drafting, someone first picks geeks, the only 3 decks they really needed to know to be able to grab in order to claim an advantage in a snake draft were alien geeks, robot geeks, and against an opponent who blocked both aliens and robots by picking alien robots as their decks, Elder Geeks. And those 3 decks were enough to claim an advantage as first player. Alien Geeks slaps anything that doesn't involve aliens or geeks pretty much in 2016. Robot Geeks also pretty much slaps everything that doesn't include one of its 2 factions. And even in a situation where you've got a tournament where maybe geeks are banned and players are able to pick everything, back in 2016, aliens would just step up to the plate and dominate everything. Their lower-tier partner faction, sort of equivalent to Elder Geeks for them, was Cthulhu Aliens. Cthulhu didn't have a Titan yet, so it was the sort of faction that you could expect to pick up on your second pick in some sort of a snake draft with a reasonably small number of players, and Cthulhu Aliens happened to hardwall pretty much everything that didn't include geeks. If you stepped down another step to having both geeks and aliens banned, it got actually quite a bit more interesting at that point because dragons would really threaten robots. But my main answer to picking robots and having someone else pick dragons, I figured if I get into this kind of a situation in a tournament match, the answer to it turned out to be a deck that I spotted someone else had mentioned was really good and I tested and it solved the dragons problem: Ghost Robots. Pre-Titan Ghost Robots actually solved a big matchup problem for robots. So it turned out that there were like a clear top 3 that all had a partner that would allow them to claim an advantage and hold on to that advantage in a snake draft, which isn't really what you want if you're looking for a healthy and diverse top-level metagame in 1v1, but this was back in 2016, and AEG has been working on fixing this ever since. I'm going to take a little diversion to talk about how geeks played in 2016, because at that point they had 2 really good strategies that were capable of giving them a top-level deck. Their big advantage was that their various control cards, Force of Will or Will Whedon to target actions, Control Minion to target minions, and Banned List to target cards in hand before they even come into play, were capable of stopping any individual threat in an opponent's deck before it even hits play. In a lot of situations, if you have the protection of one of the counterspell or gain control cards in your hand, as a Geeks player with a somewhat defensive setup in play, I realized that a lot of the time I could calculate that every possible threatening hand my opponent could have involved a copy of one specific card. Because, a lot of decks have specific power cards in them that they need to do their very biggest hands. And if I would do even a blind banned list, naming that particular card, I would have a turn of complete safety. And this turned out to be a really particularly problematic ability for Geeks to pair this bandless defense with a defensive faction, because it really, really feels bad to get slowly neutered by a defensive Geeks deck. Even worse usually than getting just bumped by something like Robot Geeks or Geek Rockstars or another fast Geeks deck. It's kind of torturous. So after that, in 2016, when I looked at this before and figured out, yeah, the defensive Geeks decks or Robot Geeks are king, and I look at this and it's like, which Geeks deck was best at that time? Wasn't all that interesting a question, because the answer is there's multiple Geeks decks that don't look the same that in the 2016 metagame are probably better than any deck that doesn't involve Geeks, and at that point, knowing which one was the very best didn't really matter, because you could claim an advantage with any of them. In 2018, AEG did something that struck a big blow against Geeks having too much dominance. They'll probably always be the best faction in the game in 1v1, but the Titan pack made them a lot less dominant. Ghosts changed from a faction that felt like trash as a beginner and almost decent for advanced players into a legitimate power faction, which could show up. If you recall what I said about how robots would claim an advantage in a no aliens, no geeks format, their answer was ghost robots. Well, ghost robots got a Titan. Innsmouth changed from an absolute trash faction. I think I had it ranked third from the bottom in 1v1 at the time, and it became a very strong but inconsistent faction. Inconsistent because in most matchups in 1v1 it needs to draw and play new acolytes at some point, which is a one of, and if new acolytes ends up in the wrong place in your reshuffle as you're filtering through your deck with locals, you can find yourself not drawing it, getting to 11 or 12 victory points, flaming out, and your opponent wins the game at their leisure. Cthulhu was already a solid above-average 1v1 faction, and Alien's favorite pocket pick as a partner in the second round of a draft. Cthulhu gained a Titan, which gave it a stronger Madness spam attack than Elder Things, and this had two positive effects against the decks that I had identified as important decks that sort of kept Geeks and Aliens broken at the very top of the meta. First off, Cthulhu will have a very good matchup against Elder Things, and frankly, to me, kind of obsoletes Elder Things as a faction in top-level 1v1. And that meant that there would be Cthulhu decks that could punch a hole in Elder Geeks. Second, because Cthulhu got so strong, it became a legitimate first-round pick in a small draft, which means that Aliens can't rely on picking up Cthulhu as a partner, which means that Aliens have much less of a stranglehold on a no-Geeks metagame. And of course, Geeks and Aliens don't have ways to directly target Titan cards, because their cards were designed before Titans exist. So there are things that can come into play that Geeks and Aliens can't deal with, except, Aliens using Terraform. And since Terraform tends to be I am going to grab a huge advantage right now, power level of card anyway, having a card that can get countered by Terraform, getting countered by Terraform is not a big deal. Terraform is going to be a gut punch, period. So I looked at this and figured out, this is definitely a more healthy metagame than we had before. In late 2019 or 2018, I'm not sure which year, I ran another big deck tournament that was probably one step shy of a Grand World Championship of decks, and it showed that the new Titans were very viable against even top Aliens and Geeks decks. It also showed that probably Geeks with an aggressive partner was a better idea than Geeks with a defensive partner, because the aggressive partner gives them a chance to actually deal with opposing Titan cards by clashing them out of play. Also, defensive Geeks decks, there's now a way to crack them, because you can't bandlist the opposing Titan out of someone's hand, and that means that Geeks would often like to not let the game stretch out too long if they're facing a Titan. And some new top-tier contender decks became obvious, but I wasn't sure exactly where they stacked up against the other top decks, like Innsmouth Geeks and Ghost Robots and something I'm not sure exactly what, paired with Cthulhu, would be joining the very top of the metagame. So then in 2019, I took a 6-month break from Smash Up to compete in Pokemon Go tournaments. I knew we had a much more interesting metagame. I didn't know exactly how the new stuff stacked up against the old guard. And when I came back, I was catching up on my rating lists, but it still took me a while before I felt comfortable enough and felt enough with the rust shaken off in Smash Up that I could actually address this question of, what does the very top of the metagame look like? Well, last February, early 2021, I decided I was ready to try to answer this question again. I picked a mix of 24 assorted top-rated decks from my own games, decks that had been at the top of my image of what the metagame looked like before, and a few decks that had done really well in that late 2018 tournament. 8 untested decks made from factions which had top faction ratings and where I thought they might be real contenders. I also added in the 2 top decks from the 2020 March Smashness, and then 6 qualifier spots for which I would eventually let 158 different decks compete to earn. So that's a total of 192 decks that had some sort of shot to compete for this grand 2021 1v1 championship. This would be eventually a field of 40, but the first thing I had to do was get through a qualifier cycle. And the funny part about this is, originally I named this the early 2021 1v1 deck championship. This was an extremely hopeful name, and I would later drop the early tag. So in the next episode, I'm going to talk about the qualifier stage, what I learned from that stage, qualifier stage, and, how did those 158 decks get turned into 6 qualified decks that would have a chance to maybe shake up my image of the metagame, because they went through a big qualifier cycle and proved themselves to be some really good decks. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you pretty shortly in the next episode.